Oh no.
This week on Videogame Nation, it's the first of our 4-part series on the last 40 years of gaming.
I go back to the 1980s when Duran Duran ran and Bananarama.
Arcade games aren't there to hold your hand, they're there to kill you and take your money as fast as possible.
IFA chats the industry's Great Depression.
The Japanese dubbed this Atari Shock, referencing the millions of unsold Pacman and ET cartridges for the Atari 2600 that contributed to the recession.
And our posse of analysts goes the length and breadth of the decade where the arcades boomed, pixels reigned and consoles came home.
All that right here on Videogame Nation. Hello television friends, high def, high five. The 1980s, gaming's great foundation decade. Almost every genre, every piece of tech we have has an origin somewhere in the 1980s. And in today's episode, we're going to count down the top 10 most influential games of that decade. Not the best. Don't go running to Twitter with your knickers in a twist and your fingers set to kill. This is the 80s. The only way to get your voice heard is to release a charity single or get shot trying to escape East Berlin.
So, 10 games that set the trends and changed the world. If you were there when the war was cold and Atari was hot, get ready for nostalgia. If you weren't, welcome to when games didn't need plots, patches, expansions, multiplayer, DLC, online co-op, campaigns, microtransactions or wireless. They just needed pills?
Well, Pacman, I think he was sort of the very first mascot, like the first identifiable character, and I think they sort of made it an icon by giving him character. Like even the ghosts, all they had was just names, but they had names that gave them personality and made them feel like actual little things that you were going after. Plus he just looked cool and it was a fun game.
Well, Pacman was one of the first characters. Like he was one of the first arcade machines that actually had not only a blob that shot things and moved around, but also a name and like something that resembled a story. It didn't make any sense as a story. I mean, you were Pacman, a floating head who was avoiding ghosts while trying to eat fruit and pills, but you know, there was something there that you could latch on to, and it meant that every time you would go back and around, you could actually grow an attachment to it. And I think that is the beginning of the sort of empathy and storytelling that, you know, became the heart of most video games.
I think for the children of Thatcher's Britain, Pacman obviously was a metaphor for the miners' strike, and that was why it was so popular, because obviously you had this little dude who was just trying to run through these tunnels, you know, consuming fuel and getting chased by the boys in blue and red and pink and orange, obviously, but I think you get the idea.
I guess back in the early 80s there weren't really many video game characters to work with, so Pacman, big, round, yellow, hard to miss. You can sort of relate to him because he eats a lot and people love to eat. And he's plastered on the side of almost every arcade cabinet that you encounter. So how are you going to miss Pacman? Miss Pacman. Miss Pacman came a bit later, but Pacman himself, he's iconic. Everyone loves him. He's everywhere in the 80s. He sort of defined what video games were for a lot of people.
I think you have to remember that in the 1980s it was a very difficult period. Madonna was trying to forge an acting career, and anything that could distract from that was only a good thing. So even if it was this kind of... Actually, to be fair, I think Pacman could actually act better than Madonna.
Pacman's a strange one, isn't it? Because he's had consistently dreadful games through the years. Apart from Championship Deluxe, that was all right. But he's actually been far worse than, say, Sonic, who's gotten a lot more grief. So you can only assume that Pacman must have some dirt on someone.
Pacman. It's funny to think that gaming's first real character was a big yellow circle with fruit lust, but here we are. But over the next couple of years, we saw the birth of quite a few other new games characters as well. Ms. Pacman, Frogger, Cubert, Donkey Kong, which also included the first appearance of Jumpman, who later went by the name of Mario. You might have heard of him. Looking back now, they were simple and addictive, and man, did they have good music. The next title is a perfect example of that, and it's so good that people are still playing it to this day. And I dare you to get to the end of the show without humming this theme tune.
Tetris was probably, it was the system seller Tetris for the Game Boy. So like, it got to the point like where it was the Tetris machine for a lot of people, and I think it was one of the first mass market, almost like a crossword or something like that, where people just understood, this is a puzzle I can get, and this is the machine I need to do that, cool.
I would argue that Tetris was actually the first truly mainstream game, by which I mean it was the first game that like your mum would play. Like your mum was never going to go in the front room and switch on the Mega Drive, but if you left your Game Boy lying around, there was a good chance your mum would pick it up, play Tetris, you know, and next thing you knew it'd be 10 o'clock and you had no tea.
I don't think there were many games before it that had such an element of like actual tension and drama from something as inevitable as just gravity.
One of the reasons why it kind of transcended beyond a lot of other games was that it's always really difficult to fit things in the boot of a car, and here along came this game that taught us how to put things together and how to slide that ladder in and that really awkward shaped L, you know, coffee table.
It was bigger than video games. It was something unto itself, and it just took the world absolutely by storm.
It made really what should be boring games fun, didn't it? Because it was just blocks falling. The games were much better than that, but somehow they got away with it. They got away with it and convinced people that puzzles were better than action games. I don't know how they did it, but yeah, it's all right.
Well, Elite was the first massive open world with seemingly endless possibilities, which is a big thing in gaming nowadays, but at the time it was mad that you could just go into a game and there was an entire universe that you could explore, and that's a thing it seems amazing now, so back in the 80s it was crazy.
Elite does stuff that games today don't do. It has ambitions that games today don't have, and you see with things like No Man's Sky and Star Citizen and even Elite Dangerous, that, you know, the latest follow-up to it, that even now we're still yearning for this idea of something so free. And even the idea of freedom in games, the idea of sandbox games, like even stuff like Grand Theft Auto, all kind of stems from this feeling of like, here's a universe, just go and do what you want.
I think Elite was the first game that explored the idea of freedom within a video game. This, you know, until then it had all been very linear and side to side and, you know, top down, and this was the first game where we got to sort of go, wow, you know, we could go anywhere and we could do anything. Of course that was nonsense because it was the 80s and it was actually limited, but it was the first game to capture that sense of freedom at least.
It showed that games could be more than scrolling from left to right, dying when you fall on spikes. It was showing that games could be something immense, open, broad and beautiful.
I don't think Elite's been influential enough for my liking. Like, that was back in the 80s, they managed to fit 8 galaxies on a single floppy disk with loads of room left. Whereas these days, I live out in the country, so the broadband's not great. If they update a game now, it's like 3-4 gig. I've got to leave my console on overnight to download that. If they had the modern attitude to efficient coding back then that they've got now, we'd have run out of plastic for floppy disks.
In 1983, America suffered a massive video game market crash. The Japanese dubbed this Atari shock, referencing the millions of unsold Pacman and ET cartridges for the Atari 2600 that contributed to the recession. 2 years later, Mario and Luigi would not only save the princess, but the entire US console market. That Super Mario Bros. Signaled the true beginning of the modern console era is enough to warrant its place on this list, but that's just the tip of the flagpole. For one, it's the game that defined pretty much every aspect of the platform genre, although credit for that must be shared with Namco's Pacman, which hit arcades a year earlier and shares a fair amount of DNA with Nintendo's classic. You should play it, it's still very good. Many of the fundamental aspects of platformers that we now take for granted, extra lives, power-ups, end-of-level bosses, ingenious secrets hidden in plain sight, can all be traced back to Super Mario Bros. It's a game that's left an indelible mark on the fabric of gaming history, spawning countless second-rate imitators and first-class peers, from Sonic the Hedgehog all the way through to Rayman Legends. It also proved that gaming characters could become enduring cultural icons. At one point, a survey revealed that Mario was more recognizable than Mickey Mouse. 30 years on, Nintendo is finally giving players the keys to the kingdom and allowing us to create our own levels with the upcoming Super Mario Maker. The fact that this still feels like a treat 3 decades on is proof that Super Mario Bros. Is not just one of, but perhaps the most important game of all time. Next up, an arcade gem that taught us the value of teamwork.
It was a little bit different to any of the other sorts of games that were like it at the time. And you think of things like Pong and stuff like that. That okay, it's multiplayer, but it's not multiplayer in a way that feels like you're all going on an adventure. And Gauntlet had that feeling of like, no, you're the wizard and I'm the warrior, and we're going to go on an adventure together. And that's just huge.
So Gauntlet is from a time when you could almost sneeze and invent a new genre of game. Like there was nothing else quite like it. Someone said, I have an idea. We got these 4 characters cooperating in this dungeon. It came out as an arcade cabinet, and that was it. That was a new genre of game that someone just thought up overnight.
My brothers had a Spectrum, which occasionally, if they weren't too busy punching me, would let me play. And I remember playing Gauntlet with my friend Joe. And it was the first time I'd ever seen anyone like rage while playing a game, and I just didn't understand. I was so small. I was just like, what's wrong? Are we not friends anymore? And then she was talking to me after. It was really confusing, emotionally.
Well, it was one of the first 4-player arcade machines, wasn't it? So that was a big deal. I guess a lot of people are going to talk about the fantasy elements, but for me, the most important thing about Gauntlet is it established 4-player gaming, which gave me arcade games like the Simpsons arcade game and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which for some reason aren't on your list of the most influential games, which is ridiculous.
I got to be honest, I never played Gauntlet, so yeah, it had no impact on me. Am I still getting paid for this? So.
The first 4-player co-op coin-op Gauntlet was Dungeons & Dragons, minus all of that boring thinking and imagination. I used to play the remake with my mates Liam and Alistair on the Nintendo 64, and even that is so long ago now that if we'd had girlfriends instead of Gauntlet, I could have had a kid by now who'd be old enough to play Gauntlet and young enough to wonder why anyone would want to. But enough memories. Time for a break. Tweet at us at #VGN, head over to the Video Game Nation Facebook page, and I will see you in just a minute.
R-Type was really hard. No, thank you.
And dangerous driving conditions are making roads extremely treacherous.
She might get into a scrape. No.
Welcome back. For me, the big thing about 80s gaming was just how hard it was. Now, we're currently used to console games that hold your hand like you've just suffered brain damage. Tie your shoes. Press X to tie your shoes. But the 80s was all about unforgiving games of skill, and arcade games that were successful would get ported to home consoles. Now, arcade games aren't there to hold your hand, they're there to kill you and take your money as fast as possible. And the most unforgiving of the home ports was Contra.
So Contra is like your classic side-scrolling 2D shooter. It's, you play as like a guy with a big gun, you're running around the jungle fighting aliens. You play as a guy called Lance Bean, who is just the best sounding action hero ever. And the other thing about Contra that was made it so incredible at the time was that you could play it with a friend. You could play it simultaneously in 2-player, which not a lot of games offered yet. And I think it really made the idea of sort of taking on something that was ridiculously challenging that much more palatable, and I think that was why people kept coming back to it, because you could pair up with somebody, and it was proper, it was proper bro stuff,
Contra impacted 2D shooters in as much as they're still making 2D shooters exactly like Contra to this day. It's ridiculously fun. Plus, it's one of the first games I remember with just jump in and out co-op, which is really, it's still used today, and it's just copied constantly and really fun.
Obviously, Contra had a huge impact on the 2D shooter genre, but also it had a sort of wider cultural ramification in the sense that in the 1980s you could not cross a school playground in Britain without bumping into at least 100 small boys with their ties sort of tied around their head like a headband in Contra. It was bonkers. And I would argue that that legacy has continued. So I don't think I've been to a video games industry Christmas lunch sort of in the last 10 years that hasn't ended up at some point with like the head of sales or operations or someone taking their tie off, tying it around their head and going pew, pew, pew around their dinner table.
It's weird to think that Contra came out in the same year as Predator, because it's one of those rare cases where games were really like in the moment of where everything else in pop culture was. It's such an 80s game, this big muscle-bound guy with this big gun running around the jungle just shooting absolutely everything. But Contra lives up today because it's still one of the most challenging but also like exciting games that you'll ever play. It's the sort of game where there's just never enough bullets on the screen. There's never enough power-ups raining down on you. It's as if you took like just this can of energy drink and you just downed it in one. It was just like, Contra! You know, and you just, you go nuts. And I think, you know, all the other sequels and everything else that's come since, nothing is quite like the first Contra.
Well, it was two-player run and gun, wasn't it? So it wasn't taking it in terms it was simultaneously you could play it. You know, that was the most fun you could have at Butlins in Skegness. As an 8-year-old, obviously, if you were a single uncle in his 20s who had a predilection for red coats, you could clean up.
It's hard to really understate the impact that the Legend of Zelda series has had on gaming. Sure, it's a simple story that we're all pretty familiar with now due to the fact that every entry to the Zelda series has been a variation on it, but really the franchise has always been about more than Link, Zelda, Ganondorf and Cuckoos. It's about adventure and excitement and wonder, a swashbuckling experience that you can enjoy whatever your age. Some people may say that it's barely changed and that it probably should have, but really it's because it stayed true to a very pure original concept that it maintained its universal appeal, and certain aspects of design were deliberately minimal. Take Link, for example. He's not said a single word in almost 30 years. His motives have never been more complex than save the world. He's a bit of a blank slate, to be honest. But that's intentional, according to his creator, Shigeru Miyamoto. He's whatever the player wants him to be, a simple avatar through which we explore a beautiful fantasy world. And that mix of exploration, puzzle solving and combat might be commonplace in games now, but in the 80s it was all but unheard of. But then that's the 80s all over for games. One minute you're escaping ghosts or chucking barrels, and then the next you're uniting the Triforce or piloting a space fighter and shooting up aliens. You know how it is.
So if you've ever played a game where you fly from left to right through some sort of a mazy thing, shooting loads and loads of enemies, that's basically what R-Type is. R-Type is like the iconic shoot 'em up, or shmup as they're called, where you basically have to navigate usually sort of a labyrinth of tunnels, and then there's like a boss fight at the end.
R-Type, you can understand why that's such a big hit, because it's so fast and intense, and there's just so much going on the screen constantly. There was nothing really like that, like the shmup genre or the shoot-em-ups that you have now. They seem like that, but at the time it was mad. You just had so many things blasting and going off constantly.
Let's be honest, right? The reason R-Type was such a big hit was because it just ripped off Alien. Like, people were less litigious in the 80s, copyright laws were a bit more fluid, and it was a game about shooting aliens. It had an alien in it that looked exactly like the alien in Alien. Like, it's very simple, isn't it, when you think about it?
R-Type really sort of, it introduced the concept of power-ups that were surprising and fun and sort of iterative, like you built up your powers over the course of this game. It also introduced it was one of the most stylish side-scrolling shooters. It showed that it wasn't all about just mechanics, even though the mechanics were rock solid, but also it was beautiful, it was big, it was hectic and explosive, and it showed that games can be artistic as well as mechanically sound.
I never understood the appeal of side-scrolling shooters. Couldn't care less. And R-Type was really hard. No, thank you.
The next game on our list proves that the challenge of defending Earth from an evil alien empire is absolutely nothing compared to keeping the crime rate down and building an efficient transport network.
This I can get on board with. Don't care about the side-scrolling shooters, care a lot about this. As someone who's known for being incredibly boring, it should come as no surprise that the idea of playing a game where you look at the minutiae of regional zoning in town planning was right up my street.
So SimCity is one of the first simulation games that there is, and it simulates something that everyone's quite familiar with, cities, which I'm sure maybe you've seen a city. But you know, drawing these roads out, it seems like on paper this is not going to be a very interesting sort of concept for a game, but it ended up being the sort of the fundament for strategy games and simulation games following on from that. It was a puzzle game, but it was also a toy box and a sandbox, and building something and watching it work and function as you expect it to There's something just really deeply satisfying about that.
It really defined city builders, SimCity. It set the template for everything a city builder was going to be. And also, you could really go deep with that game. Every single tiny little facet, even down to the way you control the waterworks and stuff like that, you could do that in SimCity. And that's all city builders are now have been trying to live up to that.
I think SimCity did so well because it really kind of captured that magic formula where you felt creative, you felt powerful and in control of this sort of living, breathing environment, but also that it had real challenge. You know, it had really smart AI and it did feel unpredictable, and that is such a difficult balance to get right. But they did it with SimCity, and I think really every simulation game since then has strived to kind of hit that magic balance, and not many of them have succeeded.
Well, what's crazy when you play SimCity, I mean, it looks pretty awful by today's standards, but everything that makes SimCity SimCity is there. You know, you've got your zoning, which can separate areas into residential, industrial, or commercial, and then you've also got the fact you can lay down roads, you can lay down power supplies, you can alter the tax, and there's even the disasters, so there's like storms and even monsters that will interrupt your city, which is kind of the fun and kind of quirky element that's existed not only in the rest of SimCity, but also The Sims and everything else that Maxis have ever made.
I think SimCity was a really important title, mainly because we tend to moan a lot about things going wrong in life, and SimCity just shows how quite tricky it is to manage a lot of things all at once. And you sort of feel moderate sympathy for anyone who has to kind of run any kind of transit system or pipes, because things can suddenly happen. Suddenly there's a UFO that could totally ruin your day. It's just these kind of things happen. It was also one of the games that I first ever really seriously cheated, and I mean crazy cheated, because the cheat code was Porn Tips Girls Ardo. That's how much I cheated. It's however many years later and I still remember it. And I remember like cheating because it was a cheat code to get extra money, and then all of a sudden the game became really boring because you could do anything. And I was like, maybe cheating isn't the way, Julia. Revolutionary idea, but there you go.
I fell in love with Prince of Persia on MS-DOS, and the first thing that got me was the sound.
Out of the speakers came strange Persian music, then the clang of a grate falling down, and you were in the game. Of course, the best noise was the beautiful sick the spikes make when they pierce the prince's chest. Then there's the animation, rotoscope by Jordan Mechner, which was so fluid and believable.
It felt like a movie. You start off by getting thrown into a dungeon and the prince moved like a person. He was human. It just felt so grown up.
Really, it's a cinematic adventure. You see it in Uncharted now. The game starts with you in a situation. Nathan Drake starts hanging from a train, dangling from a cliff. The prince gets white pyjamas and a grate. It was a simpler time. Eventually, Jordan Mechner took his love of rotoscoping and made The Last Express, the cinematic mystery game where your actions could change the storyline. So there's even a bit of a link from Prince of Persia to Telltale's Game of Thrones games. And of course, there's the spikes, which are still great.
That's it for the 1980s, the era when gaming went boom, bust, and depending on what sound card you had, bloop. Next week, get ready for censorship and Hadoukens, because we're going to talk about the 1990s, the era of turtles, hedgehog cynicism, and Michael Jackson's slow transformation into an action figure you wouldn't let near your children. Did you enjoy our list? Tweet at us at #VGN, visit the Video Game Nation Facebook page, and I will see you next week.
Chevy Chase, Lorraine Chase. Who's your favourite Chase? Mine's the American one. The Chase USA, tonight at 10:05 on Challenge.
Oh no.